Hey everybody, it's Rapid. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the worst rank 7 and rank 8 vehicles in the game of War Thunder. Now for this one I am going to cut right to the chase because I want to do something different with this video. The M1A2 HC is currently the worst win rate rank 7 tank in the game with a 42.4% win rate, 0.94 kills per spawn, and 1.05 kills per death. The M1A2 Set V2 is currently the worst tier 8 in terms of win rate with a 39.5% win rate, 0.99 kills per spawn, and 1.07 kills per death. Now these are obviously from the StatChart website, so you can feel free to look those up if you want to. However, I concluded pretty early on that because these are both very similar vehicles at very similar battle ratings, it's not really going to be all that productive to do two separate videos. On top of that, the ground that I would tread in a video reviewing these two vehicles the way I've done the rest of these vehicles is pretty well trodden by a lot of people, and I've even covered some of these things myself. So I actually wanted to do something pretty different for this video. I wanted to do a historical context review of the game of War Thunder and also a brief highlight of the meta and what stats you can reasonably expect to find on a given tank in top tier. And the reason I wanted to do this is because you'll find some very different opinions, some people saying the Abrams is great, some people saying it's terrible, and the truth is they're both kind of right in some areas, but I want to kind of go through this video just to demonstrate that. Now for this first segment, we're going to talk about the era before the T80BVM was introduced, because once the T80BVM was introduced, the American win rate suddenly plummeted and the Russian win rate suddenly skyrocketed. I'm also going to remind everybody watching here that the M1A1 AIM and the M1A1 clickbait were not in the game at the time. So the American tech tree has been having a lot of issues dealing with the new generation of Russian tanks basically ever since they were implemented, and it has absolutely nothing to do with these premium and squadron players. I also did an entire video about the clickbait, feel free to check that out, that basically came at the same conclusion. It has nothing to do with the one death leavers, the squadron players, or the premium players. That's a completely separate issue. That is not what is tanking the US win rates. Now in the pre-T80BVM era, we'll call it the pre-Russian winter era, what you essentially have is that Gaijin wants every nation to have at least one top tier vehicle to shoot for, even if that vehicle is effectively on its own. And to be honest, in this era, many of them were. I remember very fondly getting to the top of the Chinese tech tree and realizing that the ZTZ-99, at the time that was its only name, it wasn't the Block 2 then, was basically alone. The closest tank to it that you could take as a backup was the ZTZ-96A, and the closest anti-air you had was the WZ-305. Your light tank options were likewise limited to the ZBD-86, basically a BMP-1 that you would play in a full top tier lineup. And this wasn't completely unusual. Certainly some of the more developed tech trees had more options. If they were lucky, they would have a backup MBT. If they were really lucky, they would have an anti-air. Very few nations had viable top tier lights at that point, basically just Sweden and to a lesser extent USA. So on the whole, the tech trees were significantly more limited. And part of the reason why I want to go through this brief historical summary so that you can understand exactly where top tier is now is so that you can understand that when a lot of people talk about top tier and they talk about differences in stats, some of them seem to be contextualizing top tier as though it is the pre-Russian winter era where you had a huge disparity between your first spawn and your second spawn and your third spawn. To use some examples, before vehicles like the Leclerc S2 and the Leclerc S21 were added, the backup for the Leclerc main battle tank was the AMX-40, and the AMX-40 loses about 100 millimeters of penetration and effectively has no armor compared to the Leclerc, so that was a pretty big downgrade. On top of that, USA went from the M1A1A2 to the M1A1, which might not seem like that big of a deal now, but back in the day, the M1A1 only had M829, so you would lose over 100 millimeters of penetration, dropping down to your next best MBT. Germany at the time had just recently gotten the Leopard 2A6, and while the Leopard 2A6 with its L55 gun and DM53 was certainly a very high penetration weapon, the big deal for Germany was that the vehicle right behind it was the Leo 2A5. Now the Leo 2A5 at the time didn't have DM53, that was a much later addition. At the time all you had was DM43, which only penned about 481 millimeters from the L44 gun. so you would lose 150 millimeters of penetration, dropping from the Leo 2A6 to the Leo 2A5. That being said, the 2A5 was still a very capable tank in its own right, and this was a big part of what gave Germany a leg up in this era before the Leopard 2 PL was added, because Germany not only had a really good top MBT, but their backup MBT was quite good as well. This also brings up an interesting point when you start looking at the highest penetration of top tier back then versus the lowest penetration of top tier back then. DM53 from the L55 gun was the best, but there weren't a lot of shells that were that close to DM53. Most tanks were doing good to have 500 millimeters of penetration, and famously the Type 90 and even the Stridsvagn 122s at the time only had a maximum penetration of 481 millimeters. On top of that, the reload rates for tanks was noticeably slower than it is now outside of the Type 90, which was still 4 seconds, because the standard reload for NATO tanks was that you could ace them all the way down to 6 seconds, and this included the Abrams. Except for the 105 Abrams, the IPM-1 technically had a faster reload, although originally it didn't have M900. So the reloads on the whole were noticeably slower. On top of that, the variance in shell pen was pretty broad, and on top of that still, a lot of nations would experience a pretty significant drop off in terms of both armor and penetration going from their first spawn to their second spawn. So in this era, the variance of stats was fairly massive in terms of what you could expect to see in a match, and also a bit of a special shout out because this was the time when the Chinese coordinator was intentionally sabotaging a lot of their vehicles. So the Chinese top MBTs actually had a 7.5 second reload, which was the longest in the game, at least at top tier. On top of that, they were stuck with Gen 1 thermals amongst a few other downgrades. So fortunately that got corrected out, but the Chinese vehicles that you see in the game right now are pretty far cry from what that nation featured at the time. So fast forward through the Russian winter to the current era, and what are we looking at in terms of stats? Well, the biggest thing you'll notice is that basically every nation has a main battle tank and a backup main battle tank at a minimum. Most nations have at least 3, some even have 4. So pretty much every nation has multiple options for MBT spawns at top tier. Increasingly also, most nations have things like light tanks and anti-air that are viable at top tier, and the CAS options are a lot more robust as well. On top of that, as nations have rolled out newer and newer models of MBTs, what they have effectively done is reinforce the armor on the strongest part, but not really address the weak points all that much. So the vast majorities of MBTs have been heavily reinforced in areas where penetration would have previously made a very big difference. And of course, this is not to mention the shell creep, where now DM53 is in at least 5 separate tech trees, although not always on the L55 gun. In fact, the Leopard 2A6 itself with the L55 gun is currently in 3 different tech trees. So the firepower creep in terms of shell penetration has been pretty substantial. The armor creep has been pretty substantial. And on top of that, you're not seeing a lot of players taking out really anemic backups unless they are a premium or squadron player. Of course, all of that's just kind of rambling. Let's put up some real stats so you can try to visualize exactly how good or bad the nations have progressed over that time period and where everything sits now. So up on the screen, I have some of the more common top MBCs you'll see for a respective nation, along with the maximum reload and the maximum penetration on their respective shell. The fastest reload is 5 seconds, which is currently on the M1A1 Set V2, the TKX, the Leclerc Azure, and the Merkava 4M. It's also on the Arietes, although you don't see Arietes as much in Italy unless they're digging pretty deep. The longest reload is China at 7.1 seconds. This is also shared by the T90M and T72 family, although the T80 BVM does sit at 6.5 seconds, and pretty much all of the NATO Leopards and other tanks are sitting at 6 seconds. So in general, the difference between the maximum reload on a lot of these tanks is around 1 to 1.5 seconds in most situations. On top of that, if you were to look at the shell stats, what you would see is that the lowest penetration is on the Leclerc Azure, which is 575 millimeters, and the highest penetration is DM53 fired from the L55 gun at 652 millimeters. Now, this chart is a little deceptive because there are several nations that have this shell that are not listed on this chart. While Germany, the UK, and Italy do use an L55 firing DM53 as their main MBT, Sweden also has it as a backup in form of the Leopard 2A6, as does France. So a total of 5 of these nations actually have this shell. So half of the nations listed here have access to a shell that can pen 652 millimeters in their inventory. But this also means the difference difference between the best penetration that you're going to see at top tier and the worst penetration you're going to see at top tier is only about 70 or so millimeters. And this is actually the crux of why shell penetration is often not as important as people think it is, in addition to the fact that many of these MBTs, as they have evolved, have simply reinforced their armor in the heaviest part so that even DM53 cannot reliably pen it. So in essence, what you're effectively doing is you're shooting the same parts of the enemy almost regardless of which shell you have, with only DM53 from the L55 gun occasionally being able to pen specific areas that other shells can't. So here are 3 heat maps of common enemies that you will fight at top tier. You have the Abrams family, this is specifically the VII, you have the Leopard 2A7, and then you have the T80 BVM. The top one is the heat map for what you can penetrate with the lowest penetration shell on the Leclerc Azure, and the bottom one is what you can penetrate if you have the L55 gun with DM53. Now, if you look closely, you will notice some areas, especially around areas like the breach, where you have a little bit more wiggle room on these vehicles, but as you can clearly see, the differences are pretty minor, and for the most part, you will be aiming at basically the same part of the enemy, almost regardless of which shell you're using. And this is actually part of the reason why, on the whole, if a tank starts with a dart, I don't usually prioritize getting the best possible dart all that much, unless it is something like DM53 from the L55 gun. A lot of times it just doesn't make that much of a difference in terms of where you aim. Now here we can see a brief comparison of the total horsepower and the horsepower per ton that each of the top MBTs for each nation has. And as you can see right off the bat, these are actually pretty similar in terms of the horsepower per ton, which is the total power that you can generally expect out of the vehicle in most situations. Obviously, the UK is the biggest outlier on the bottom end with only about 19.2 horsepower per ton, but I think everybody expected that. China actually has 27.3 horsepower per ton, which is unexpected if you aren't familiar with the tanks, but they are somewhat light and agile. On the whole, though, the average seems to be between about 22 to 27 horsepower per ton, so you're not noticing a really big difference in mobility. Now, to be fair, there is an additional factor of the RPMs of the engine and also how the transmission is geared. The VII does have more immediate acceleration because of the gas turbine, so it can definitely feel more responsive. But on the whole, a lot of these vehicles do generally drive pretty similarly. And obviously you do have the major outlier of the Russian reverse gears that are absolutely terrible, but again, for the most part, the rest of these MBTs are behaving in a very similar fashion. So the obvious question is, why are we going over the general gun performance and the general automotive performance of these vehicles? Well, it turns out the main advantages of the Abrams and the reason why it sees a lot of competitive play is that it has a lot of active advantages. But when you lay all the data bare, it's very clear that the active advantages the Abrams have are fairly narrow and not really insurmountable by other vehicles. Really, the area where the active advantages of the Abrams family come into play is when you go into competitive matches. In competitive matches, every small percentage point can make the difference maker when you have theoretically the best players playing against also the best players. However, in your average matchup of the random queue, these minor percentages of active advantages are not going to be anywhere near as telling. On top of that, it's very important to note that active advantages are much more reliant on crew skills than passive advantages. Things like reload, turret rotation, and how well or poorly your tank accelerates are heavily dependent on crew skills, so having an expert or even ace crew can dramatically improve the performance, whereas somebody coming in with a level 10 or level 20 crew, especially if they're buying their way through with a premium, are going to notice a lot less get up and go out of that active performance. Passive advantages, however, things like simply having good armor or having small weak points, is persistently an advantage no matter how bad your crew skills are. On top of that, you also have things like Russian vehicles that simply start with their best reload. The same can be said for Japan and France with their autoloaders. And of course, this wraps around to one of the more awkward aspects of the Abrams, and that is its fairly poor passive advantages. While the Abrams does have good turret cheek armor and good upper front plate armor, one of the major disadvantages of the Abrams that has always been an issue since it's been in the game is that it has a fairly large and prominent weak point basically dead center of the vehicle, so if your opponent is just clicking on the middle of things, they are much more likely to hit the Abrams weak point than they are any other tank. This is also compounded a little bit by some eccentricities with how Gaijin currently models APFSDS rounds. Now, in theory, Gaijin will model these correctly at some point, but who knows when the hell that will be. But the short story of this is that the reason why the Abrams has such a large and prominent lower front plate is that the upper front plate had to be at a very steep angle to consistently bounce sabos, which in testing it very much did. The problem in War Thunder is that sabos actually bounce, more like a traditional shell. In real life, if a sabo were to bounce, what you would get would just be a hunk of metal that wouldn't be terrifically ballistically intact and wouldn't have a lot of penetration. In War Thunder, it does tend to kind of bounce it into the turret ring and also disable the Abrams. So if one day Gaijin does ever get around to modeling sabo physics a little better so that this doesn't happen, this might improve the Abrams armor, but as it stands right now, this does contribute to the Abrams having fairly poor passive advantages. This also isn't helped by the fact that the Abrams has a fairly large turret ring and a fairly large engine. Now, the turret ring was bug reported at this point about 2 years ago. That bug report was never addressed for whatever reason. Feel free to ask Gaijin, I have no idea. But anyway, because it has a prominent turret ring and a very large engine, what often tends to happen is the turret ring gets hit and the engine gets hit. And it turns out if you can't move your tank and you also can't rotate the turret, you basically have no way to shoot back at the enemy. This was a problem I noticed from the very first time I picked up the Abrams, which is a very long time ago, was that while it was reasonably common for the Abrams to survive hits, it was very uncommon for the Abrams to survive hits in such a way that it could actually return fire. And this continues to this day, only it's actually gotten much worse with the introduction of things like the turret basket also functioning as a turret ring and all the other various subsystems that have just made the Abrams a bit of a chore. On top of that, and this is another thing that Gaijin is currently failing to model correctly, when your blowout panel triggers for some baffling reason, it will basically take the round out of the chamber, in addition to taking the round out of the magazine. So while you should theoretically be stuck with one round in the chamber and no round in your magazine, if your blowout panels do trigger, you will be stuck with no ammo and no ability to shoot back unless you go to a capture point. Hopefully they'll fix it one day, but who knows. Now, this also brings up the finals of the last Armored Apex event, in which it was 4 Abrams versus 4 Abrams. And the big thing to note about that map is it was actually Kuban. Now, Kuban has a lot of smooth undulating hills that allows the Abrams to really take advantage of its immediate acceleration and its excellent gun depression, in addition to its other generally positive features. However, if you were to check the top tier map rotation right now, you would know that it is physically impossible in the random queue to get Kuban with the Abrams. It is not anywhere near that high in battle rating. In fact, most of the maps where the Abrams has the opportunity to really shine and really be potentially an amazing tank are not actually in rotation at top tier. Top tier tends to have a lot of maps that are either very flat or that have such extreme slopes that you basically need a crazy amount of gun depression to even hope to make use of them. So on the whole, what you usually find is that the maps are perfectly well suited to tanks that have little or no gun depression, rather than requiring or even making a tank better by having a lot of it. And I do think it is important to mention competitive play in this, because as we have talked about it a few times, the Abrams often ends up being the darling of competitive play, and it really comes down to the active advantages. The best players are able to make use of them, but also in Armored Apex you actually do have your crews fully aced, so you don't have to worry about potentially not having the maximum reload, not having the maximum turret rotation, not having the maximum acceleration, etc, etc, and these are things that will actually affect a normal player in the random queue. On top of that, in Armored Apex, you both have the spotting system and generally a team in Discord communicating with you, so you generally know where the enemies are, and there are so few enemies, 4v4 or even 5v5 in the mixed battles, where you can keep track of where the enemy is at all times, which means that you're going into most fights with enough information to use your active advantages efficiently, and combined with the fact that, as I said previously, these are some of the best players and those percentages matter, and this really lets the Abrams as a family shine in a way that it doesn't in the random queue. In the random queue, the skill of your teammates and your opponents are a lot more variable, the information you have available is more confusing, and there are a lot more people on the map in general, so the likelihood of you getting shot by somebody you didn't see or didn't realize was there, or that was sitting right next to your teammates and your teammates just didn't see them, is exceedingly high. and how well your tank responds to taking those hits is actually a big deciding factor. And unlike the Leopard 2A7V or the T80 BVM that can frequently eat those hits and still be able to return fire, the Abrams just really can't. What this in turn means is that while the Abrams can be incredibly good in the hands of a single skilled player, or can be amazing in the hands of a well-coordinated team, it can also be somewhat dodgy if you're basically in a giant free-for-all, which is essentially the random queue most of the time. And I think that's the origins of why you have such variable opinions on the Abrams, with some people thinking it's amazing, other people thinking it's trash, and to at least some extent, neither of them are entirely wrong. But as I said with my top tier review series on USA, the worst you could ever give the Abrams would be a B grade. The worst case scenario, it's still a fairly competent tank in terms of mobility, it still has armor even if it doesn't feel like it still has a punchy gun with a fast reload, and it still has responsive mobility. So I still stand by calling it an A grade tank, but I also fully understand that when you're in a random queue environment, it's not always easy to leverage those active advantages, and you often end up having to lean on the passive advantages that the Abrams is somewhat lacking in. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. Feel free to let me know in the comments down below what you think about the Abrams family. Do you like them? Do you hate them? I always love to hear from you guys. If you liked the video, found it entertaining, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.